Diabetic retinopathy. This is kind of demographics and things like that. Diabetic retinopathy is the leading cause of blindness in working age adults. That's why it's important. Why is it good that you've gone into ophthalmology? Well, here is the prevalence of diabetes in 1994, and this heat map shows the percentage of diabetics. The hotter the state, the brighter the red, the more diabetes there is. As time passes, you see the United States gets in general redder and warmer, and especially if you tend to work in the southeast United States, you'll be plenty busy with plenty of diabetics. Part of the reason that the prevalence got so warm between 1994 and 2015 and even hotter as you get towards 2020 and 2025 and potentially 2030 is that the definition of diabetes did change in the period between 1994 and the current era. They tightened the criteria to some extent. So there's a bit of apples to cranapples in this heat map, but still the trend is more diabetics, and more diabetics means more sick people. And since medicine, at least as it's practiced in 2019, is a transactional business, the more sick people you take care of, the better you'll do. You're all in a growth industry. Congratulations, you've chosen wisely. Diabetes makes you sick. About a third of diabetics do have some diabetic retinopathy, according to the CDC. What's interesting, though, if you look how sick they are, about 11.5 per 1,000 have a stroke, and 18 per 1,000 have heart disease. And these are all diabetics who are more than 35 or 40 that are in the small print there that the CDC looked at. A lot of us in this room are encroaching on 35 or over 35 or over 40, and probably none of us have had a stroke. So, this is a significantly sick population who's about the age that you're going to be when you're practicing, and they've had strokes and heart attacks and they're not well. And it's something to think about, especially as we develop more and more potent and long-lasting and not turn-offable VEGF inhibitors and things like that. What's the most common symptom of diabetic retinopathy? Nothing. Exactly. The most common symptom of diabetic retinopathy is the upper left. It's nothing. Maybe if you look at the lower right, you get these dull or muted colors or reduced contrast sensitivity. That's awfully tough for a patient to complain about in a fashion that makes sense to an eye doctor in the 7 seconds you're going to give them to tell you about their eye problem. By the time they've developed the floaters in the lower left or the darker empty areas in the upper right, they're pretty sick. It's significantly advanced. The most common symptom of sight-threatening diabetic retinopathy is no symptom. And that's important to remember when you're out there looking at people's eyes. The most important thing that a patient can do, aside from quitting smoking to reduce their risk of diabetic retinopathy progression, is reduce their A1C. In general, according to older data from the early 2000s, and this goes even further back in the early 2000s, which is when it was last published according to the citation here. If you go back, I think it was a UK PDS study in the 1980s that showed that every 1% reduction in your hemoglobin A1C level, you get a 50% reduction in the risk of progressing to diabetic macular edema. And that might be a board question. For every 1% reduction in A1C, there's a 50% reduced risk of DME advancement, approximately. So A1C is the most important thing that your diabetics can manage aside from their smoking status. So when you see a diabetic, make them learn their A1C. What percentage of your diabetics at the VA know their A1C? You ask them?
Some do. 0 to 5. 70%.
70. So one said 0 to 5%, one said 70%. Are you guys working at the same VA?
Yeah, I took care of my kids. Oh, you have left?
Much less.
I think 0 to 5.
Well,
maybe they know 1 blood sugar.
Yeah.
So you look it up in the labs, yeah. So in real life, you're not going to have the access to your patient's labs. And it's nice to ask them. It's nice to give them a homework assignment. And my homework assignment for them is just learn your A1C. I don't care what it is. I want you to tell me what the number is next time you come. And I write down A1C. And I give it to them on a sticky note. Plus they get their souvenir diabetic retinopathy patient brochure, which is super important. Always let your patients leave with souvenirs. When you have private practice, give your patients something. They love to leave with something. Give them A1C, have the text give them the diabetic retinopathy brochure. They love that because they're never going to go on the portal. They're never going to read your notes. They're never going to call you to see when their next appointment is. So give them something to take home and an appointment card. Okay. This is again looking at the demographics, that the number of patients is going to be much greater than it is today. What's remarkable, though, is how few diabetics are actually treated. This is another CDC-derived funnel of patients with underdiagnosed or undertreated diabetic retinopathy. So there are about 30 million patients with diabetes. The assumption is about 7 million of them, or about 20% or so, 25% have diabetic retinopathy. About 2 million are diagnosed and 620,000 are treated, according to the CDC's estimates, which implies that there's a significant undertreatment of patients with diabetic retinopathy. That's a good question. That's something we'll get to later if we have time. Do you have to even treat patients with just diabetic retinopathy? Should you treat patients with just diabetic retinopathy? Traditionally, treat patients with diabetic macular edema or proliferative diabetic retinopathy. But even if you mitigate for those conditions, there's a likelihood that a lot of diabetics are undertreated based on the prevalence and the incidence of diabetes in the United States currently, and it's a variety of reasons for that. What do you think the biggest reason is, Dana, for diabetics not being treated in the United States?
Insurance issues.
Access, that's probably true. Insurance, access, paying for it, things like that. It's probably the number one reason. But the president's going to fix all of that, he promised. The other thing is they just don't come in for their eye exams. If you look at the incidence of patients who have diabetes who report having had an eye exam, the incidence of the eye exams has increased from 2006 to 2015, which is good, but it's still low. You know, that number should be, you know, the ideal is for it to be about 100%. But a lot of patients don't believe that the eye exam is necessary, according to a diabetes care publication from 2014. The numbers that I believe in these slides are the CDC numbers, which are the percentage of patients who actually get the eye exams. There are initiatives to help incentivize primary care providers to get patients more eye exams. They have these things called HEDIS scores now. Do you guys know what HEDIS scores are? It's probably not something that you're taught about right now, because there are no implications for ophthalmology at the current time. But HEDIS scores are a type of quality score, and your primary care providers are going to have their pay tied to getting high quality scores, and one of those quality scores is getting your diabetic patients an eye exam. So since the patients don't make the translation from the primary care office to the eye doctor's office, it doesn't have to be an ophthalmologist, it can be an optometrist to get the HEDIS score. There are other technologies that are doing the eye exams and satisfying that score. Do you guys know what any of those technologies are?
Telemedicine.
Like telemedicine, that kind of thing, exactly. The first artificial intelligence, FDA-approved artificial intelligence medical device finished its approval process in 2018. It's actually a fundus camera that will read a color fundus photograph and make an interpretation as to whether or not there's diabetic retinopathy there. The optometrists are using it already. It's probably going to find its way into primary care offices. I find that to be actually a positive thing, because it will find diabetes that we then have to treat. It's not replacing the ophthalmologist, it's augmenting the ophthalmologist. But there are ways that they're trying to widen that funnel that's currently too narrow to get more diabetics into the ophthalmologist's office. So again, congratulations, you're in a growth industry. You're all going to be very busy. I hope you like to work. How do you grade diabetic retinopathy when you see it, when you have to make a chart note? You guys grade it like this, pretty much?
Yeah.
4-2-1. Yeah, 4-2-1.
Unbelievable.
Thanks, Steve. Sure. Let me get that. My partner's so good to me. He gets me breakfast when the hospital comes.
One of these is an egg white with muffin on the lid.
Oh, egg white. Oh, thank you.
For calories.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, low calories. Fewer calories.
Orange juice is yours.
Okay.
Is this my coffee, Steve?
Yeah.
I get a water too. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yep.
Hold on, let's see which one this is.
Uh-oh. That looks like egg square.
Okay.
Egg square. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what color it is.
Got it.
All right.
I think our good come around this way. It's back way. Good. Fantastic. So you guys, when you guys grade diabetic retinopathy in the chart, you kind of grade it like this: NPDR of mild, moderate, or severe, and then PDR. Do you guys use a more discrete grading scale? Or is this pretty much what you do? Do you guys even divide the NPDR up into mild, moderate, or severe, or not really? Yeah. This is the ICD-10 scale, so this is probably what you're led to when you're kind of going down the pick lists or the pull-down menus. There are more discrete scales. There's the ETDRS grading scale, the early treatment for diabetic retinopathy grading scale in the middle, which goes from 10 to 85. Nobody uses that in private practice. That's used in clinical research. And then there's a modified ETDRS scale, which is also used primarily for clinical research. But it's important to know about those because one of the big topics for 2018 was diabetic retinopathy regression, which we'll get to if we have time. All right. That's pretty much all my stuff on demographics, and we'll go on to the next lecture.